Autism, Racism, and Ableism in the DHH community. Amelia England, SC Vocational Rehabilitation Department. This presentation is brought to you by First Community Bank, We Lend Local.
We would like to take this opportunity to share with you this presentation about autism and things that do affect the deaf and hard of hearing population and communities, and the effects that are outcomes of autism and ableism and racism. Particularly of importance is teaching our deaf and hard of hearing to stand up for themselves. If the parents are hearing individuals, we need to encourage our deaf and hard of hearing children to speak with their professionals in their area, adults, their counselors, their teachers. And I wanted to take an opportunity to speak about biases and the oppressive effects of autism. The notion that one is superior based on one's ability to hear or to behave is the manner of one who hears, which is a quote by Tom Humphreys. The issues of autism, levels of government and society create direct, indirect, and or systematic discrimination and discriminatory behavior against deaf people. Someone who is an autist could also be viewed as a racist in some perspectives, but an autist is particularly an act or a word used against a majority of the time the deaf and hard of hearing communities, people who sign. Autism is a word most of us would choose to use over other vocabulary. But autism is an act of discrimination against people who have a disability. Ableism is a structure that can have a wide range of effects, and discrimination happens against deaf and hard of hearing people is specifically called autism. And an example of autism, people who know how to sign, but who do not sign when a deaf or hard of hearing person is there in the group, would be an example of autism. Or people who think they are superior to someone else, particularly talking about stories or shrugging or waving off someone who's deaf or hard of hearing and not including them, or doing the gesture of read my lips. That is something that would not be viewed as equal access and could be viewed as autism. And autism is a view of deafness. And there could be two different views or categories, as you see here on this image. deafness as pathology. You have people who use cochlear implants. You have people who use hearing aids. This here is a list on this screen, a different comparison between the first view of deafness as a pathology and the second view of deafness as a difference. And there are various things listed in both of these categories to compare how those two perspectives are different. Racism within the deaf community. There is a much longer list than is here. And might not be a word that's used for all people with disabilities. We recently lost many lives with the Black Lives Movement, and that has been an ongoing movement for many years. And injustice still exists for all marginalized groups, but autism is particularly crippling. The deaf Black community had no communication access with the national civil rights organizations and their leaders. And it is often viewed with the color of your skin as to how much power you have, when in fact it shouldn't matter what color of skin you have. And no one should be superior over another person just based on their disability or non-disability or the color of their skin. There is a lot of stories that can be heard, seen, viewed, and a lot of different perspectives that need to be considered. The deaf Black community, for many years, particularly in our history, had no access to communication at all. They were shunned, very much put aside. I would like to show a YouTube video, and there's the link here on your screen, about the effects of linguistics and autism on the development of a deaf person. And there is a person focused on in this who was involved in the research and studies of this. Cognitive language and the holistic approach within the a person's deaf experience. And there will be a PowerPoint at the end that can be viewed for access. Awful.
if I can see it, I can't see it. Many of you have heard of the term autism. It's a new term. It was coined in 1977 by Tom Humphreys. He wrote about that term in his PhD dissertation. And by autism, he meant some attitude which was prejudiced against hearing people. So the idea that deaf people were broken, needed to be fixed, or were inferior. And that if you wanted to be happy in this world, you really needed to be hearing. Linguisticism is related to autism, and the first time I heard that term was when Dr. MJ Bienvenu was presenting at RIT. She was the keynote speaker at one of our conferences, and she mentioned linguisticism, and that struck a chord with me. And it's about some prejudice against language, believing that one language is inferior to another. Many people do not believe, for example, that ASL is equivalent or has the same status, or is able to express the same things as English, for example. There are many studies which have been carried out in this field, but I want to talk about one study today which really looks specifically at the notions of autism and linguisticism. And I want to talk about resilience and this resilience. Of course, people experience stress, disagreements, adversities. That's the nature of life. If you don't have much resilience, you have a weak resilience, then let's see what happens. It really knocks you back, and it's hard to get back on your feet and really bounce back and get on with your life. It's very problematic. However, if you have a strong sense of resilience, this is what it looks like. Of course, it still knocks you back. It's just that you have the wherewithal to get up on your feet and carry on living your everyday life. So resilience is that power. And it's very important for school, for universities, for success in life and mental well-being. And there are two other important terms I really want to talk about now. Protective factors and risk factors. Protective factors, in terms of resilience, thinking about protective factors and risk factors. Protective factors are those things that help us develop a strong resilience. And risk factor are those things which cause our resilience to be weakened. So I just want to ask you all a question. Is being deaf a risk factor? Do we think that being deaf itself is a risk factor? Well, the team I work with don't believe it to be the case. There are many successful deaf people out in the big wide world who have excellent qualities. They earn more money than the average Joe. They're very successful deaf people in education that do much better than their hearing peers. So it doesn't appear deafness is a risk factor. But we would say that some kind of idea of internalized autism is a risk factor. That the idea you're continually exposed to being need to be fixed, or that you're broken. If you've internalized those ideas that you need to be fixed, then we feel that in and of itself is the risk factor. So we wanted to see if we could set up a test to see if that were the case. It's the Connor-Davidson scale, measures sense of personal competence, tolerance of negative effects, sense of social support, and acceptance. Well, I suppose the big question is, how do you measure this? There's a number of tests out there, but we use one which has been used with teenagers and young adults to ask them a variety of questions about their resilience. And it's a multiple choice, just a pen and paper exercise. So we use that for the task. So I suppose the next question is, how do we measure internalized autism? And that's kind of where the fun starts. In the research field of social cognition, they have a variety of different methods, one of which actually is used to measure racism, sexism, and other kinds of prejudices. So we borrowed from that mainstream test and actually tried to adapt it for autism. It's a computer-delivered test. And the idea is that you push computer buttons and you measure reaction times. And this gives you the idea of what it looks like. There's good pictures and bad pictures. So I want you to remember these pictures. There's one set of pictures that which say something good, and there's another set of pictures which demonstrate bad things. So please take a good look. So if we look at the screen, we can see we have good on one side and bad on the other. So if you see something that is good, I want you to point to that side which represents good. And if you see something bad, I want you to point to the side that represents bad. Okay, so that's good. Well done. People, you're with me. Right, that's bad. I see you get it. Okay, so here's a little practice for you. Well done, everybody. It was quite fun to watch you all pointing to an empty space. So now let's play with another idea. We have pictures, deaf and hearing. If we think about the idea of deaf and hearing people, and we don't remember the faces, if it's a blue frame picture, then it means they're deaf. Yellow framed, it means they're hearing. Okay? So I'm going to do the exact same as before, only I want you to point in the space that represents deaf and point in the space that represents hearing. All right, here we go. Yep, you're with me. Well done. That was the practice. Okay, that was actually the practice. Now I want you to start the real experiment, which is another layer of complexity. We're going to try and mix the two conditions of deaf and hard of hearing, good and bad. If you see a picture, a drawn picture, which is good or bad, you need to point to good or bad. And if it's framed, blue or yellow, deaf or hearing. Got it? Right, that one's deaf, well done. Over here is bad, yes. Let's proceed to the next stage. Now I'm going to run the test again, but now the fun starts. I'm going to swap where good and bad is located. And now bad is to your right. Okay, so let's have a go. The way we score is quite complicated. We have a fancy algorithm to analyze the data, and the whole point is the reaction time. And we administered this test to a variety of college students. It's a computer-based test, and we analyze their reaction times in different conditions. We have a result scale 5, deaf, good, bias, to 5, bad. So they co-occurred at the same time, whether that correlated with somebody having strong sense of deaf being good, and it was an internalized value, and if we had deaf and bad on the same side. Those people obviously would have a slower reaction. However, if someone had internalized the notion that deaf was bad, they have quicker reaction time when deaf and bad were on the same side. And we were trying to see if we could rate people's internalized attitudes, whether they identified deaf as good or deaf as bad. So we split the group in half, and we know that one side was internalized and the other. And so those who would say deaf was good, we would say had some protective factors, strong resilience. Those who thought deaf was bad, they had internalized autism. Now, you can remember that we also had that task that we administered, the multiple choice looking at resilience. Obviously, they scored high. That meant they had a strong resilience, and low score meant weak resilience. And we were interested to see how they correlated together. And that was interesting, is to those who saw deaf as good, scored the same level of resilience as their peers. Which is not the same. They clearly had internalized autism and had weak resilience. So what appeared to be protective factors? For us, we thought actually looking at deaf studies was an important field. And we often So again, let's think about how we can measure the notions like deaf culture. There's a test which is actually developed by a colleague here at Gallaudet University. The deaf We found that those who had high levels of resilience were people who socialized with the deaf community, American Sign Language reproduction test. We were also interested in looking at sign skills. A team of us were involved in developing a sign skills test. And on this scale, you can see high levels of ASL fluency and low levels of fluency. Those who had stronger levels of resilience also had better signing skills. So it seems that signing seemed to be a protective factor. So why is it important to use sign language and be involved in the deaf community? Well, our theory is about deaf capital. By capital, I mean knowledge and skills that you get from the deaf community. It also, almost like a toolbox you carry around. When you meet other deaf people, you gain knowledge from their experiences of navigating the world. And so when you're out in school and something happens that's frustrating, you have the tools with you to be able to deal with that. And you may have remembered at the beginning, I mentioned the term linguisticism. I think that is the problem. Many people don't value ASL. We know so many deaf people are actually born without deaf parents, and they don't have deaf capital. They don't have exposure to sign language. Of hearing families, less than 25% use sign language, which means many deaf children grow up with very poor, impoverished language skills. So this seems to be a risk factor. So in summary, internalizing autism is a risk factor. Deaf acculturation and sign language skills are protective factors. Autism is bad, linguisticism is bad. Deaf acculturation is good, learning sign language is good. The reason I think autism and linguisticism is bad is because in society, the ASL involvement in deaf community is important to us. So we need to educate them. We need to mentor young deaf children and young adults so they can in turn educate, lead, educate other people and become leaders. Thank you so much.
The question that's been asked is, how can I get teachers to have high expectations for my child? That's a really hard question to answer. My suggestion is try to get the teacher of the deaf, particularly in the state of South Carolina. I would start with them first and find out where the child is to see if we could be engaged or engaging with the teacher, spread the word about information, regarding the deaf community, exposure to anything and everything as much as possible. And it's not an overnight fix. It's going to take a lot of collaborative effort and data collection but information, get as much information to people as possible. The question here, what can hearing parents do to recognize, or how can they recognize autism? And that's a good question. Parents won't know what autism is unless you get the information from us and explain it to them. So again, spreading the word throughout the state of South Carolina, getting parents to see as much examples as they can related to autism, and hopefully it could start spreading and the understanding from there.
Thank you, Amelia.